Patch 0.2.0e just dropped with huge overhauls to the campaign such as zone size reductions, removals of dead ends, monster speed improvements, and rune crafting improvements on top of the recent reductions to monster life. There's also a bunch of player skill buffs and some endgame improvements such as showing all rares on the maps and slowing down deliriums. We've also been promised some big changes after the weekend, including an overhaul of the charm system, including giving us more charms on belts, stash tab affinities for loot quality of life, and bookmarking for the endgame atlas. These are absolutely massive sets of changes just days after the release of 0.2.0, and many of them to things that seemed unlikely to change anytime soon. So why the massive turnaround, and how did we get here? It's safe to say a good number of Path of Exile 2 players have not been happy with this recent update to the game's early access beta. With relentless, let's say passionate posting on Reddit and recent Steam reviews dropping to mostly negative. Overall, the initial 0.1 early access launch held a mostly positive review score and got lots of praise for the polish of its visuals, music, combat, bosses, and difficulty, with one of the most upvoted Reddit threads of all time praising the game's challenge and reward, which may seem strange now if you've been following along with the drama. The launch was certainly not without its problems, with a huge number of players getting stuck dodge rolling in place and a lack of loot being felt by everyone. But GGG was quick to respond with changes to many of these issues, with big buffs to dodge rolling and campaign loot drops. There were still lots of issues left over, of course, especially with endgame feeling barren, placeholder, and rather grindy. But overall opinions seemed fairly optimistic given GGG's responses thus far, and the fact that this was just the beginning of likely a year-long beta. For many, it appears that 0.20 Dawn of the Hunt didn't show the direction they were hoping to see for the game. In addition to a new class and some much anticipated improvements to endgame progression and content, it promised huge nerfs to overperforming builds. Nerfs that the community as a whole has been clamoring for after 4 months of Herald of Ice builds, attribute stacking, and mana stacking just dominating builds and stifling creativity. Unfortunately, it seems that Dawn of the Hunt missed the mark for most players, with unintended side effects of balance changes making an already hard campaign just much harder. An overall reduction in player power revealed long-standing issues in loot, balance and skill design and campaign design, and the overall leveling experience from a fresh start. These things may have continued just to be kind of a dull murmur in the background of an otherwise positive update, but the majority of the player base was already walking on a tightrope in Path of Exile 2's campaign. They're just barely managing to make it through a very punishing game with the occasional moment of aggravation. A death to some swarming enemies that felt a bit unfair, backtracking down a long dead end, or struggling to find a good item upgrade to beat a boss. But these moments were tolerable as players were just powerful enough to move on and forget about it, enjoying the experience of the rest of the things that the game had to offer and its many other highlights. But Dawn of the Hunt brought everyone's power level down to a point that even content creators and game veterans were struggling. And if the game's most experienced are struggling, then how is the average player doing? Not well, clearly. All of a sudden, those somewhat overlooked moments of frustration became all the more punishing. They became brutal issues or even hard walls that caused players to quit, or to look for anything and anyone to dump their frustrations on. So what issues did Dawn of the Hunt reveal, both new and old? Every person has their own take on the problems as they see them, and often these are wildly different issues or even conflicting in many cases, but here's my attempt to distill it down to the core. People felt weak on average or even good builds. Finding a powerful feeling build is the exception in a genre where power fantasy is usually the expectation. Challenge is also expected in this genre, but as a vehicle to drive that power fantasy, not to keep you away from it. So this was seemingly caused by a number of issues, including monsters being too fast compared to players, and tangentially combo-based gameplay without the time to pull said combos off. Players doing too little damage, taking a long time to even kill normal monsters. Zones being far too large, and as a result the campaign feeling long and grindy. It feeling very difficult to get gear, and crafting feeling just weak or non-existent to many players. And it's important to remember that Path of Exile is a game about fresh starts every 3 to 4 months. Whenever a new season comes out, people start fresh and do the campaign once again, but people won't necessarily be willing to run a 20-hour brutally difficult campaign quite that often. The topic of discussion has very much been on the campaign, but There is certainly some remaining issues about endgame progression feeling boring and there being far too much punishment for failure. So really, almost every complaint I could find fed back into just this one idea that players felt weak on average. There's a lot of disagreement on the specifics, with some players wanting the campaign to not even exist or to just be a couple hours of face roll power fantasy, other players wanting it to be challenging but feeling like they didn't really have realistic or fun ways to overcome that challenge, and other players that had a good time honestly but disliked a couple specific issues a lot even though they were overcome them. And that's me in that last category, by the way. I had fun overall and could overcome the issues that I ran into, but my fun was still being diminished pretty actively by issues like overly large zones and backtracking. So what have GGG done, or are they doing, to fix the problems? Let's take a look. There was a lengthy discussion on monster speed in the recent Q&A between Zizarin and lead producers Jonathan Rogers and Mark Roberts, which was a long, somewhat brutal at times, but very important interview. It came at a rather timely moment and was probably quite difficult for both of these developers to do, to come out and defend the vision they have for the game, which is very important for leadership to have, but also still to be able to listen openly and take this criticism that can be really hard for many of us to do. So certainly major props to them for taking on that rather important interview at a time when I'm sure many other developers would simply clam up and not interact. So on the topic of monster speed, GGG notes the importance of being very careful here, as monsters do need to be able to bring non-optional threats to players, and they need to be able to disrupt combos to prevent the gameplay from becoming repetitive, optimized skill rotations in the style of many MMOs, something I personally agree with. They did concede that there are too many swarming enemies in many zones though, and that they go area by area, monster by monster, and make adjustments. And true to their word, within a few days, we have a patch just released with a laundry list of both broad and specific changes, addressing things such as enemies that could animation cancel starter step, lowering numbers on swarming enemies, and adjusting AI and cooldowns to ensure things like, for example, after a werewolf lunges at the player and sprints at them, they will then walk instead of run until the player moves far enough away, which they will then begin their faster running sprint, rather than just doing that all of the time. The overall idea here is that fast enemies die fast, and they give openings to kill them. And there's just much less of them overall, so that it doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. This change seems to hold fast to their vision of keeping some threats and disruptions important for the challenge of the game overall, while making things much less oppressive for the player. It's worth noting that combo-based gameplay is something some players just don't like. The developers have said that it's not intended that you have to perform complex combos to kill just basic monsters, but that you be rewarded for them for bosses and for more powerful rare monsters. They've also separately mentioned that they plan on keeping some playstyles and skills that will just be simple, just single skills and things like that that can work reasonably effectively, but that they will keep making more interesting skills, supports, and items that do reward skill combinations. I suspect the issue here of feeling like combos are mandatory is less one of game design and more of the fact that the game was simply just too hard. You couldn't really do combos due to monsters being too fast and difficult, but you also kind of had to do combos because otherwise you just weren't dealing enough damage. That's a pretty rough combination. Hopefully this is something that eases just with changes that impact the overall difficulty in player power. Next up, players doing too little damage and taking a long time to kill even normal monsters. There were many things affecting this issue: monster life, nerfs to skills, gearing and crafting issues, and even things like monster speed, meaning that players were kept on the back foot and unable to attack themselves. Earlier, several hotfixes tackled the monster side of things. Monster life was lowered significantly across the board in the campaign, and things like regeneration abilities were removed from rares, finally. There were also clips of players failing to kill white monsters, who were often the minions of rare monsters. These had a huge amount of life bonus, which was reduced from a whopping 400% down to a far more reasonable 94%. There's also been a number of targeted buffs to certain skills, though some of them may have been a bit hasty in reaction to the community outcry and the size of it. With some skills like Lightning Spear, for example, found to actually be overperforming. They just kind of didn't give it enough time to settle in. And then the buffs that they received have seemingly led to them having huge representation in the endgame now. That's a problem for later though, but it does mean that inevitable nerfs correcting that overcorrection will hurt more players who have become accustomed to how it is now. The life changes, skill buffs, and changes to monster skill speed, and changes I'll go over for crafting in a moment, have likely helped the player damage issue pretty dramatically. It's quite likely that though balance issues do remain in the campaign, the issue of players feeling like they do no damage should be limited to just the undertuned skills and not the average to good ones, which is where we want to be for now until balance can be sorted. Zone size feeling too large and the campaign long and grindy has long been one of my personal core complaints since the beginning. The developers' response in the past has been that they intend to fill those large zones with lots of good stuff, so that it's good they're big. After all, that means less loading screens. And that's a nice idea in theory, but the issue is that often large zones means lots of backtracking and difficulty finding quest objectives, and these things could be solved on a case-by-case basis, but any issues that are there are aggravated by the zone size and also the overall difficulty of the campaign. It also just means that big zones are a large time commitment. If it takes you half an hour to do all the things in the zone, then, well, that could be a little bit difficult for the average player to commit to. The addition of checkpoints in previous updates have helped backtracking, allowing players to warp around the map, but the issue does persist somewhat, and it's definitely exacerbated by problems with low damage and overall difficulty. So the developers have conceded the point somewhat and adjusted many of the largest zones, trimming dead ends and reducing some of the biggest and grindiest zones in size dramatically. This is focused exclusively on Act 3 so far, seen by many as the worst offender. There are likely, I think, some zones in Act 1 and 2 that could still use some adjustment overall for the game's pacing, but opinions on these are much less unanimous, so it might take a bit longer for those changes to come. Endgame still has an issue of overall map size and layout, which some people are divided on, but GGG is somewhat firm on for now. But it's worth noting that changes such as showing all rare monsters on the minimap dramatically helps the endgame map issue, as you can now track down required rare monsters and just leave without having to explore the whole zone. This can reduce some of the biggest maps by half or even more. Often the issue with those huge maps was just backtracking and exploring to find that one rare that you missed, but being able to beeline directly to them now is a good solution, at least as a band-aid for now, for the map size issue. Getting gear felt impossible and crafting weak or non-existent, so the issue of gearing is somewhat intrinsically tied to player power and monster life. Buff skills and nerf monster life, and your requirements for what good gear is change, right? The devs have stated that they intend for you to have a mixture of blue, magic, and rare yellow gear during the campaign, that they also want upgrades to feel meaningful as well. They did note, however, that they've likely been playtesting in a way that didn't align with how many players actually approached the game, so I imagine that we'll be seeing some reviews to some things like access to regal orbs and overall gearing options. But more tangibly for now, however, they noted that their intended player control for gearing problems, which is runes, was not covering the problem properly. So the recent patch just rolled out some pretty huge changes in this regard. Many runes now have powerful modifiers for wands and staves for spellcaster builds, which previously just did not exist. Many artificer orbs, which allow you to add a socket to your gear, have been added to specific locations throughout the campaign. Exploring around now will result in up to 12 additional artificer orbs in addition to regular drops. Exploring around in the campaign now will result in up to 12 additional guaranteed artificer orbs. This should greatly lower the reliance on grinding and salvaging gear for sockets. There's also been some guaranteed runes added to several locations, including a quest when you retrieve the blacksmith tools in Act 1 that allows you to choose a rune that you need. Runes that provide attributes have also been added to help players solve gearing issues while leveling, which is pretty common. Not having enough strength or dexterity or things like that can now be addressed directly with runes. These rune changes will be a massive improvement, as in the early acts, actually getting sockets on decent gear drops was very difficult. It's likely further crafting and gearing improvements are warranted for the campaign and the game as a whole, but these changes, along with an overall power increase, should make gearing much less of an issue in the campaign for now. So the overall big, broad issue of Path of Exile being a game about fresh starts is something that I admit I hadn't really considered. I do personally enjoy a fresh start campaign run. I'm a re-rollaholic. I always loved restarting games and rarely ever finished them. But it's quite true that the longer and harder the campaign, the less keen many people are going to feel to do it again a few months later. I know some people want a campaign skip, and the devs have been very clear that that's never happening, okay? They consider it an ultimate failure, an admission of defeat in their quest to make the campaign fun and interesting. They're taking the harder route here, right? Like, they're not picking the easy road. Their desire to keep a significant and sizable campaign in their game that gets done every few months means that they have a lot more work to do. They have to address all of these issues and make sure that it's fun for players to run through, or at least tolerable for those who will never enjoy it. And that means a lot of iteration. The changes they've been making here will help make it faster, less grindy, and more fun for more people, but this is going to be an ongoing issue that they're going to be addressing approximately forever. The endgame progression is boring and there's far too much punishment for failure, so this topic of endgame, There are still lots of things to be done to the end game. Obviously, it's very early days there, and they've stated pretty clearly that this is like half of what they really want to have there, maybe. Most of the discussion so far, and the reason for the negative reviews, has really been very directly resulted to the issues with the campaign, and just the overall picture that people felt like GGG were painting with the direction of the game, and that it didn't align with what they wanted for the game. But I still did want to touch on the endgame a bit here, as it's a big part of the problems that 0.1 had, and it's obviously going to be the next thing that people run into after the campaign. So, Dawn of the Hunt's biggest win, in my opinion, all of these other issues aside, and very much buried by those issues, is how much work it's done to the endgame. Work that many people who got stuck in the campaign or quit are just never going to see, maybe in next league. There's still a year's worth of work and content to be added to the endgame, but 0.2 seems to have taken a big leap forwards. There's now clear goals on the map. Towers, unique maps, and corrupted areas all create like this breadcrumb trail that gives you the feeling of, ooh, I might just do a few more maps so I can climb that tower and see what's over that water there, or that you just kind of do that unique map that you revealed, and then that reveals your next corrupted zone, which reveals your next thing. The corrupted zones also now do something. There's a special map with a corrupted boss, a Nexus map, and that fight gives you progression in the endgame quest and passive tree, as well as just being a more interesting thing to have happen every few maps. It also cleanses the zone, creating maps filled with monsters that drop extra currency and maps that you can do afterwards. There's also just a bunch of interesting extra random modifiers on the zones that can occur, such as bonus bosses and corrupted spires that make you explode monsters. On top of that, there's new rogue exiles, strong boxes, and wisp encounters. None of these individually are that exciting. I do quite like the exiles. But the combination of all of these things results in the average basic map just feeling a fair bit more interesting. It's just got more going on. The recent change to reveal rare monsters also just makes finishing a map much faster. So you can travel around the Atlas like 2 to 3 times faster now, I feel. You had to do about 80 to 90% of a map before on average to actually complete it. Now I think you can get away with 30 to 50%, I kid you not, on some of the larger ones. They also made it so that to complete boss maps, you only have to kill the boss now. You don't have to kill all the rares. So that's a lot faster. You can often just beeline to them in some layouts. And there's much more boss maps in general going on, especially with the tower changes. And on that note, tower maps have been massively improved. The layouts are varied and fun. They have extra content on them, now including their own bosses. There's far fewer of them on the map and they're way more impactful. They don't just feel like kind of like a late game degenerate juicing mechanic, but they're actually a kind of intrinsic part of your map exploration system. When you complete them, you can use up to 3 tablets to affect dozens of maps in one go. You're encouraged to juice them to make that more impactful. It can really not be overstated how completely overhauled towers are as a mechanic. So if you just hated the entire idea of them and the well has been poisoned for you a little bit, definitely try to consider the new design of the towers as being something that's just fundamentally very different to what it was before. A side effect of their large radius now too is that they're also just excellent for exploring the Atlas to find other interesting things. More unique maps are also added into the game, and that's a welcome addition to spice things up, and they seem pretty common so far. I've found like 5 or 6 feral megaliths as I'm just wandering around. These maps also give Atlas progression points now too, which is great. Map progression overall has become extremely deterministic too. That last rare in a map drops a guaranteed map of the same tier, and bosses also give you at least one of the next tier. So I've never not had a map needed to progress, and it's been very smooth, but there has been some issues with it. Unintended side effect is that some players seem to be jumping up tiers too fast, going to tier 15 in a matter of hours before they've even like done any of the Atlas quests or have any passives, and just being like, I'm just running empty tier 15 maps. So there's obviously something there that they're gonna have to solve. My method has been to go up a tier after each corrupted nexus, which feels like the intended design, and it's buttery smooth. On the topic of punishment for failure, things feel much better when progressing. It's pretty typical to run blue 2 modifier waystones or 3 modifier regaled maps, and these give you 4 or 3 allowed deaths without losing the map. To spice things up, there's a requirement to do a 4 modifier map for corrupted nexuses, and that allows 2 deaths, so they're a little bit spicier. And you're also encouraged to do towers with 3 or 6 modifiers to unlock more tablet slots. I recommend doing 3 while progressing unless you're feeling pretty confident. The overall picture is that you get lots of room for errors in your kind of general mapping, and it's pretty relaxed. But then there's interspersed with that the occasional, sometimes optional, maps of increased tension and risk. So I get what they're going for here, and it seems to be working pretty well for progression at least. There's still issues for them to work out. For example, when you fail a boss fight, it deletes everything else in the map, causing you to ideally want to finish the map before doing the boss. So that's a kink they can hopefully work out. And it does also seem that it's likely the issue is just somewhat being kind of, The can has been kicked down the road, so to speak. It's been pushed back to higher tier maps where you then might be alking or running 6 modifier maps consistently and thus back to 1 attempt per map, and that may feel like an issue. We'll see how that plays out, but at least there is more player control there and you can reduce that if you so desire. So the endgame now feels unfinished, but like a very solid foundation now for PoE2's endgame, whereas before it felt almost like a full placeholder. It's much more fun and interesting than the one we had at launch, that is for sure. So is Path of Exile 2 saved? What do you think? I think some people had such a bad time in the first few days that they won't look back this season, or maybe for several more, and that's a real shame. I do think that some people who made it through the campaign won't get a chance to feel a lot of the changes that GGG has made to the campaign here, so they might still be kind of left with an overall sour taste. Also a shame. But I think if you were to start now, you probably would wonder what everyone's going on about. So that's a good sign. It's looking good at least for next season when people do another fresh start, provided we continue the positive trend here. The campaign experience took a big backward step, but it seems to have ended up ahead of where we started, so we've come out ahead after all of this drama. It's had some positive impacts on the game for sure. Things that weren't likely to get looked at for a long time, if ever, have been fixed, which is some pleasant surprises out of all this. And endgame overall seems to have only improved in my opinion. Balance continues to be a mess on player builds, of course, but that's to be expected at 0.2. I think if things look like this at 0.8, I'd be concerned, but at this point, I expect a wild ride for the next few expansions as far as builds are concerned. The recent changes to balance have been pretty awesome though, and upcoming changes to things like charms sounded like great improvements for the players. But what do you think? Have the changes made a big difference to you so far? Is Dawn of the Hunt saved from the jaws of a way too fast werewolf? And how is the next big update going to look after this? What does it mean for the future? Anyway, that's it for now. I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.